I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hammond, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to the second hour of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, as you know, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, in case you didn't catch that in the first hour, or each night as I say it. And I always remind you folks that we are internationally syndicated in the U.S. via late night in the Midlands with the terrestrial networks associated with it, as well as deprogram radio in the United Kingdom with their terrestrial stations in London and Leeds. Joining us is someone that was supposed to be here Tuesday night, but because of my fault was unable to do it, Mr. Patrick, or Dr. Patrick Andenhall. Patrick, may I call you Patrick?
I'm not a doctor, but yes, Patrick Andendall.
Oh, I misread that. Definitely misread that. Now, I got your third book. This is actually the third part in a trilogy. Deliverance from Stupid Party Land. How to Eradicate the Destructive Forces Destroying American Democracy. Part 3. The first one being Math versus Myth, and the second book, Who is Jeb? Literally coming from the beginning of JFK assassinations to talking about the Bush dynasty, which that's a lot of great things we can go into that. But one of the reasons I specifically wanted you now and wanted you on Tuesday, which actually now we know a lot more answers, is because of the midterm elections. And it's because you are definitely someone who pays attention to these things and saw what's been happening to this swamp in this country. I figured who better to talk to you than you about this topic. So first, here's something that I've yet to bring up to anyone other than Daniel Estelin off air. And that was the person I spoke to yesterday who wanted to come back because he was on Monday. And I told him I was actually going to have you to talk about this. And so let me ask you this on air. Mr. Jeff Sessions.
Oh, I hope you wouldn't ask that question.
Yes. Let's talk about that, because I expected that, but I didn't expect it to be hours, literally hours after the ballots were counted.
Well, that's the one question I was sort of dreading, because I'm not a lawyer and I don't understand the implications. Obviously, it's terrifying, but that could be my own lack of knowledge about what's going to go down from here. I do not know. It's obviously awful and really scary. I've been reading various people, what they think the implications are and where it will lead, and I haven't seen a pattern as to what will happen. So it's a bit like Brexit, We have all the politicians in England talking about it, but you can't find a pattern as to what the hell's going to happen. So with Jeff Sessions going, I think you need to be a lawyer and understand the American Constitution better than I do, but it's obviously terrifying.
It's ironic you talk about the Constitution and a lawyer, because I am one, and my brother just brought me a copy of the Constitution, I guess just for, I don't want to say the S word, for S and giggles, just literally, I think, to throw it in my face. I think it's going to have some substantial impact with the Mueller probe, but that's just my personal...
Well, that's why we care. It's the Mueller probe, and yes. What are the implications? I wrote on my blog, on my website today, my analysis of the 2018 election, and I talk about the Sessions thing, but I don't draw too many conclusions because I simply do not know.
Now,
but I'm scared, obviously.
Yeah. Now, a lot of the leftist media, as a matter of fact, Roger Stone, when he was on, I confirmed one thing for me. I told him that I've discovered One American News Network, OANN, and ever since then I've stopped watching Fox News, because OANN seems to actually present facts as opposed to try to spin the stories. Every other channel, from ABC, CNN, MSNBC, you name it, across the board, BBC even, was talking about this blue wave, which turned into blue tsunami, and all of a sudden ended up being a red tsunami. But that wasn't true with the lower part of the house.
Well, wait. I mean, let me interject there, because I still haven't come to a conclusion about that either. First of all, obviously the House was good news. There was a time during election night where Nate Silver's projection of us winning, the Democrats winning the House, went from 90% down to 30% in a 45-minute time frame. And I just had those echoes from the 2016 election where there was a whole tsunami of surprise results. And I think I have a better idea why nobody really pegged it. But right now, the Senate is looking a lot better today than it looked 2 days ago. It looks like we've just taken the lead in Arizona, and I'd be surprised if we don't flip Arizona. And I got a good feeling that Nelson may have a fairly good chance of retaining his seat in Florida. And if you had asked that 2 days ago, I think everyone had written that off. So it could be fairly close to where it was before, which, considering how bad the map was, and winning the Senate was considered a very outside chance, that would mean that it was a blue wave. Obviously, we should have done a bit better than 35 seats. I figured we'd probably get 50, but at the end of the day, I'll take 35.
The thing is even though we lost the lower house, the fact that we gained more seats in the Senate no longer means...
No, the other way around. The other way around. I mean, we got the House.
The Senate gained the House. The lower house is what the liberals want. Nancy Pelosi is going
obviously and here we get to this whole thing. On the one hand, you've got the vital check that we need to prevent massive levels of corruption. So right before when the Democrats weren't controlling the House, if somebody in Georgia or Florida wants to cheat at the polls and create extra voter suppression and all the rest and destroy ballots, whatever they're doing, there would be no repercussions for that. But if you have, obviously the Republican Congress has no interest in investigating stuff like voter suppression. And now, if people had been engaging in breaking the law, we suspect that may have happened, I think, in Georgia, and probably happening in other states. California. There will be consequences. There will be consequences, and hopefully these guys will realize that they may go to jail if they break the law. So that's what the country really needs. Is you must have consequences for breaking the law. And for the last 2 or 3 years, there have been no consequences for breaking the law because the Republican Congress has refused to investigate anything of any interest at all. The investigation into the Clintons over the last, by the Republican Congress has cost, the last 15 years, $100 million. That's effectively taxpayer money gone into their campaign coffers because clearly they weren't genuine investigations. They were just there to queer the pitch. They were there to damage Clinton's campaigns. And that's basically the taxpayers funding the Republican campaign. And so now, obviously, the House now flipping to Democrats. I don't think we cheat to that level. I mean, they're twice as good at gerrymandering. They're the only party that's interested in voter suppression. I mean, what's the point of a Democrat trying to suppress votes in some rural county? There are 5 people. How are you going to stop them from voting?
That's right. Speaking of the investigation to Hillary, I believe is it Mark Whitaker or regardless, the acting attorney general who stepped in right now, or Trump at least appointed, announced that he would reinvestigate Hillary into the emails of the State Department.
I mean, that's just a waste of time. I mean, we've been down this road 100 times. I mean, who cares? I mean, if they're going to waste more money and just put more egg in their face, it's just irrelevant.
That's what I was just going to say. How many more millions of dollars of our own taxpayer dollars are going to go to waste?
And it's pure politics, and that's anybody who's trying to play that game, you just know they're third rate.
Now, one of your other books leading up to this third one, Deliverance from Stupidparty Land, when you wrote Who is Jeb? And you actually talked about the horrible stories of the Bush dynasty. I want to ask you real quick about the Bushes because the Bushes and the Clintons were very, very close. I mean, there's lots of pictures where they're, hanging out together at the boat. Literally, before George Herbert Walker Bush got, this much older and got more sick, but when it was him and his wife and George W. with his wife and Bill and Hillary Clinton, it seemed like a happy six people hanging out at different places, at different resorts, and they're all smiles. You never saw that little anger between them. And what I gathered from it, it was more of a show. But specifically about Jeb Bush, when he was trying to run in 2016, I remember because of watching Get Me Roger Stone, when Roger Stone was doing a radio interview and he was talking about Jeb and he was sort of imitating what Jeb was saying. It was like, Father, it's my turn to have the kingdom or the keys to the kingdom. And sort of I got that implication from watching Jeb Bush and the arrogance that I saw, because he was the first one to, I think, drop out of the Republican candidates in the primaries, but he also put in the most amount of money. Well,
let's just talk about the Bush family and talk about the supposed friendship between the Clintons and the Bushes. First of all, when Bill Clinton ran in 1992, it was clearly Karl Rove, on the instructions of Bush Sr., started threatening Clinton with digging up all sorts of dirt that they possibly could. So that all the Clinton supposed scandals, Whitewater especially and stuff like that, which is a nonsense event, started with Karl Rove, started with George Bush Sr. Now, the reason why I wrote this book about Jeb Bush was sort of accidental. I'd written my first book, Stupidparty, Math v. Myth, and in my introduction, I made some rather just simple statement about George Bush Sr. It was a fairly polite line. I didn't really want to get into him, and I really didn't know much about George Bush Sr. And I wanted journalists to sort of endorse what I'd done. His name was a writer called Russ Baker, who'd written the book Family of Secrets. I had lunch with Russ Baker, and he was very upset with me because I'd made this throwaway line about George Herbert Bush, and he said, "I can't endorse you. You can't write that." So I read his book, and I read a ton of other books, and I realized, you know what? He was right. So I told him during lunch, well, I can make up for errors because I can blog about it and I can write stories. So I spent 6 months trying to write a blog about George Bush Sr., and everything I wrote just would collapse in upon itself. It's too complicated. There are too many conspiracy theories. It was like, oh my God, you just pull your hair out and I can't go down this road. Nobody will believe it. Da, da, da. So I just gave up. It was not possible to write a blog really discussing George Bush Sr. properly. And so I had that sin living under me. So when Jeb Bush ran, I suddenly thought, my God, I can deal with the Bush family. I can atone for my sin by discussing the Bush family in this way, in a more overarching nature. So I wrote this book, and it's probably one of the few books that does not delve really deeply in any type of conspiracy theory at all, because you'll go insane. And there are conspiracy theories, and I'm sure some of them are on point. I mean, clearly the only conspiracy theory about J.F. Kennedy, if you're using conspiracy theories in a negative, the only negative conspiracy theory is any notion that Harvey Oswald acted alone. Of course he did not act alone. And once you figure that out, other things start falling into place. But I let the reader, by just looking at facts and things that actually happened, figure that stuff out. So I wrote this book about the Bush family without delving into really relying on any conspiracy theories at all. And the reader can just figure out the histories. And of course, my big beef generally, and why everything's gone wrong since the assassination of J.F. Kennedy, is oil, American oil policy. And the Bushes, they have oil for blood, and they're rolling in that. Jimmy Carter in 1978 made a speech about energy independence and how important it was to get hold of it. Americans, on a bipartisan fashion, ignored him. And that is America's original sin after slavery. Because that, obviously, on the one hand, you got global warming, on the other, but the more prescient would be Middle Eastern wars, and the fact that American taxpayers are funding both sides of all of these wars at the expense of us incurring them, and we're also paying for our, if you want to call them enemies, for enemies were basically funding that through oil dollars. There's no need ever to, if you had an intelligent energy policy, to import oil. And if you didn't have that issue, we wouldn't have had all the issues that have occurred since then. So actually, I think that oil is the biggest problem that's led to the descent of the American moral authority since 1953.
Oil and the petrodollar that's attached to it, and the fight that the United States always wants to keep the dollar standard on the oil for the globe, for the entire globe. Every time a nation wants to try to separate itself, it starts another conflict. And like you said, it's caused every problem since 1953.
Well, the really exciting thing here is oil is done. The battle is intellectually and economically is won. People haven't figured that out, but oil is on the way out. And that's one of the really exciting things happening right now. The mass right now to defeat oil exists right now. It's just a matter of producing the products and sorting it out. But oil is beaten. People just don't know it yet, and that's really good news.
It is, and one thing I've always been arguing is why, if we have all this technology available, are we still burning chemicals to have an internal combustible engine, which actually
there's no need anymore. I mean, the cost of batteries, I forget the number, maybe 5 years ago was $800 for whatever. Now it's down to about $120. They've always said once you get to 100, we have an economic, there's no need for an internal combustion engine. We're pretty much there right now. Obviously, we're talking primarily Tesla and Panasonic, the technology they've got there, and they're going to make all other cars pointless.
Now, Tesla has started the concept car essentially to prove that the technology is working. I mean, Elon Musk,
But the beautiful thing, the new Roadster that will come out when you get to SpaceX mode will just make anybody who thinks that they have an interest in buying $1 million Ferrari or whatever, will just make those people look absolutely nuts. The Roadster SpaceX edition will probably do 0 to 60, I'm guessing, in 1.6 seconds. Really? I mean, what's the point? You can get that car will be a fraction of these $1 million supercars. So once he's beaten them on that score, and now he's beating BMW across the board in the United States.
And he just announced another model. I believe I saw it on the news yesterday that is actually selling, like you just said, beating BMW. And
well, first of all, the Model 3, which nobody knows, is the best-selling car by revenue in September in the United States. It's a passenger car.
Now, let me ask you about your trilogy of books. What made you start the trilogy on Stupidparty, beginning with Math versus Myth, and then, like I said, Who is Jeb, and the one that I have in my hand, Deliverance from Stupidparty Land?
Well, what made me write the book was the constant line of failure on my part. You have to go back to 2004. In 2004, everyone in the United States should have known, and did know, and should have known, became a fact that the Iraq War was based upon the country being misled, probably knowingly misled, and thus that was probably an illegal war. And it's simple as this: what worse crime can a government commit than leading a country into an illegal war? But 65% of Republicans or greater back in 2004, after the 9/11 Commission, still thought Saddam Hussein was behind that attack, the 9/11. Sarah Palin in 2008 still was saying Saddam Hussein was behind the attack. This is all utter nonsense. And so I went there in 2005. I went to Cleveland, Ohio, to help Kerry. And I chose Cleveland, Ohio, because mathematically that was clearly going to be the nexus. That was where the 2004 election would be determined. But I was not the only person to figure that out. Karl Rove also figured that out, and he flew out at about the same time as I did, and he conspired with Ken Blackwell to suppress votes, take polling booths out of minority areas in the suburbs of Cleveland, not suburbs, in the inner cities of Cleveland, I should say. And I was there that night, and I witnessed the results of those voter suppression efforts. It was pouring with rain. There was definitely enthusiasm from all the places I was visiting, the housing tenements and all the rest, and it was, and they were there. But it was pouring with rain, and I saw people leave the line, having to go home. A lot of people simply cannot spend 5 or 6 hours online. They got kids who may be going away. They got problems at home. They got to cook for the family. They got tons of problems to worry about that people like you and I probably don't have to. You and I, we might be able to stay in line for 5 hours. They can't. And I saw them disappearing from the line. I saw them, and it was just so depressing. It was American democracy being raped, effectively. And I was so sad. And that night was, even though the exit polls had Kerry winning by 5 points, somehow it didn't transpire to an election. And it's also funny how we're always getting disappointed. The progressives are always getting disappointed by election results, especially in places like that. And I saw CNN saying, why are the polls always wrong and all the rest? Well, I bet they tend to be only wrong when you have a governor, a Republican governor in charge of that particular state. Because voter suppression has huge consequences. And the reason why even Democrats maybe tolerate voter suppression is because they don't understand one basic principle. Voter fraud by the voter is mathematically irrelevant. There might be 20 in an general election, of which probably mathematically speaking, 10 might be Democrats, 10 might be Republicans. So it's just they net each other out. So it's like zero impact. And yet, based on all this nonsense about voter fraud, people somehow accept the need for voter suppression. Now, in the UK, we have 650 MPs. In living memory, I've never heard of an MP complaining about the result because they're all counted properly. I've never heard about lines so long people can't vote because we don't do that. I've never heard about gerrymandering because you have non-partisans figuring out how to distribute these election boundaries. So we don't have any of this nonsense, and it's got to stop.
Speaking of gerrymandering, right here in Southern California, it was just actually, I believe, 4 years ago, or maybe a little longer than that, a local congressman, actually two local congressmen, because they had to redistrict and they were both Democrats. Well, these both incumbent congressmen all of a sudden had to fight for the same seat, and both have been sitting there for a long time. Brad Sherman ended up being the winner, and he's still in the House of Representatives, but that was really the first time I saw it play out in my own little backyard of Los Angeles. But gerrymandering, this is something that goes back, I believe, 200 some years, not too long after the foundation of this country, right?
Well, yeah, I guess. And, Americans will say, oh, well, how can you have non-partisans? Because obviously England has no problem because you have a non-partisan civil service. So Americans say, well, who's non-partisan? If someone like me says, well, try somebody with a brain who solves problems. Try a professor. Oh, they're all liberal. But but Colorado has just voted in a law, I think, with this election on Tuesday night. They figured out how to do it. They're going to have non-partisan boundaries. It's quite a complex process. I read through it very quickly. I don't want to go into it now. But when I read it, okay, that's going to be non-partisan, so it can be done.
Now, how can we get rid of a two-party system? It seemed like we started to have that happen, I believe, in the 90s, but then Pat Buchanan ended up taking the Libertarian Party. I believe it was the Libertarian Party, and it was sort of destroyed. But when you bring it back to even earlier, I think it might have been Ross Perot, or correct me if I'm wrong, who it was, who actually during the election of 92 that ended up having a disproportionate amount of votes that cost George Herbert Walker the election.
Well, I'm not advocating for or against third parties, all right? And I agree that two-party system is not ideal. I'd rather stick to the basics of what's fundamentally wrong with the American knowledge about basic issues. I'm not sure if by promoting third parties you sort of lose the point. And bear in mind, look how much damage third parties have done. I mean, whether you like Ralph Nader or want to be or not, just think what would have happened to the world if he had not run in Florida in 2000. We would have had Al Gore as president. We would not have had that war. We would not have these ridiculous Supreme Court justices. And the whole world would be different because of that third party. If you want to run as a libertarian, only do it if you're going to take votes away from the Republican. Libertarians, I have a few problems with libertarians, to be honest. I mean, Alan Greenspan was a libertarian, and it's unfettered capitalism that led to the Great Depression in 1928. It was unfettered capitalism that led to 2008, or libertarianism, effectively, that led to 2008. If you'd listened to Ron Paul's solution in what he'd talked to about before the meltdown in 2007, he'd done what he said, the whole world economy would have collapsed.
And that's actually really sad that we are controlling the world economy. Actually, you have one graph here when you're comparing what the U.S. compared to the UK where was it that I found it? 98%.
Was that, are you talking about
versus
spending on
2%.
election? I mean, for instance,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Well, that goes to the root of all the problems, of course. In America, every congressman of each party spends on average 5.5 hours a day raising money. And then that means they're only listening to the people who give them their money. They're not remotely interested in listening to their constituents. Rather than listening to their constituents, they're telling their constituents what the problem is. They're telling their constituents, oh, blame the immigrants, because that's easier than blaming the people who are funding their campaigns. So why do you think you have so much racism in this country? It's based upon stuff like that. There's way too much money in American elections. And in the UK, they have their own problems, believe me, but we don't really have to worry about that. And you can go and, as a constituent, you can go and talk to your MP and say your husband, your wife, or your husband's dying of some black lung disease because he's going to a coal mine. That will go right to the Prime Minister. It'll be raised in question time, and they'll look at the mine and they'll put in air purifiers. If the same issue happens in the United States, they go to the owner of the coal mine, and the coal mine will say to the congressman, "Oh, well, I can't afford that. That will mean I have to fire everybody." So that's the message.
I'm sure you've seen what's been happening with Bernie Sanders leading the fight with, trying to bring socialism to this country, and now Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Well, let me fight that one back. Bernie Sanders, and the word socialism is such a confusing word, so it gets bandied around, and very few people know what it means. I don't know what it means. Are you talking about North Korea? Are you talking about Sweden? Are you talking about the UK? Now, you take Bernie Sanders; he's the most left-leaning senator in this country, but I argue, what is odd about his platform? Maybe you can debate whether everybody should have free university education. I don't know the answer to that, and that's a debate we could have. But you can't debate healthcare. Obviously, he's right. You can't possibly argue that the American healthcare system is better than other countries. It's number 44. Yeah. And because the healthcare system is based on insurance companies, and it should not be. I'm not saying you need to get rid. I'm an insurance person. I'm not saying you should ban it or prevent it. But clearly, the public option was the way to go, and that would lead to single payer. The only reason why it did not happen under Obama was because the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies banded together with senators like Joe Lieberman, and they prevented it from happening. So hence, you have Obamacare, which is a huge bonus, but it's still a Band-Aid.
The problem with the healthcare in this country is, with, like you said, with the insurance companies, is you have businessmen, not doctors, making decisions that affect your health.
But it's also the math. I mean, obviously, you should not have businessmen making life or death decisions. You don't have businessmen. It's theoretically, you don't have the army isn't privatized, the post office isn't privatized, and all sorts of things the government should be doing. But when it comes to insurance companies, it's basic math. They have to write to a 65% loss ratio, which means 35% is just out of the window before you even begin, just in expenses. And that doesn't even cover all the problems of just debating and discussing coverage issues. Just see the doctor already. Go. In America, you can't do that. No, you can't. Now, let's just, because you've obviously we're able to compare the United Kingdom with the US of A, and you've seen the difficulties that we face here, not just in healthcare, with the elections. Let's talk about some other issues that you've started to see, that you've written about, that if you had the power to change yourself, assuming that we had a monarchy in this country, assuming that there was abolishment of the Supreme Court. I dream of being my own little benign dictatorship.
Yeah, exactly. Let's just assume that was there. What would you be able to do to start to cause
I have it.
I
have it in like one of the chapters in my book, which is not deemed, which I'm not putting forward as a solution to the country's problems, because I don't think it's going to happen organically. Because we're on this path, and I'll explain why, that it's very difficult to see a way out of, but I've seen something that might help us. But obviously the biggest thing, and my Smart Party agenda, by the way, would be supported, I believe, by about 80% of the American population, and therefore you have to ask, why is it being ignored by Congress? Because the Congress is not remotely interested in what American people think. But obviously the most important thing would be taking money out of politics. Now, And most people would agree that that needs to be done. But the problem is American people aren't willing to pay the piper. They're not willing to pay for it. And one of the reasons they're not willing to pay for it is because they're given an inflated number of how much it costs. So whatever number a Republican will tell you it is, you probably need to reduce that number by 75%, because you don't need to give the maximum amount to every single candidate in the country in every single race. So money out of politics. Another thing you had another thing. Did you have another gun shooting today? And I can't keep track. In Florida,
right in
California. Obviously, here we go. So Americans need to understand. I'm not going to waste my time advocating for gun control. Let other people do that, and it's also polarizing. And people can argue it won't be effective, and they have a point. But Americans need to understand that America has the most infantile gun culture on the planet. That's number one. And number two is they need to understand that more guns, as a general rule, do not create more safety for you. In fact, a gun in the home is a liability. And you look at the higher the gun ownership, I've done these statistics, and I think in my first book, Math v. Myth, possessing a gun creates all sorts of hazards. And people who think that arming a teacher with a gun, I mean, it's probably got the size, your brain must be the size of like a pea. Because just think of all the problems that are related to that notion. Some shooter can't, I mean, first of all, if you're not going to stop a kid who wants to shoot people up, you can put metal detectors up all around the place and all this. You're not going to stop it until you stop realizing that guns are just not a great idea. And that's what the American public needs to understand. Putting guns in schools is just absurd. And only an American Republican who know nothing, by the way, and I can prove that in my book, how they just got virtually every issue totally wrong. Only an American Republican would say, "Oh, let's arm the teachers." I mean, it's just absolutely insane. So of course you're going to have more and more mass shootings because you've got this. They're still getting away with it, and then people aren't saying one simple thing: a gun in your home is a liability. You might get depressed, you lose your temper, you might be off your meds, there might be an accident, and then if your neighbors need a gun because they see you have a gun, and then now the criminals, they got guns, I need a gun, and a criminal comes into your home. Really, who's got the advantage there? If both of you are armed, well, the criminal's going to have the advantage. He's got the advantages of surprise. So. The whole thing is just totally insane.
Speaking of that shooting you were just talking about, that's 25 miles from where I am. And somebody came in with smoke grenades, 2 smoke grenades, at least from one witness, shot and killed 12 people, including one police officer. I remember when I was growing up, the first shooting that I remember, well, actually this happened before even my time, was the Texas Tower shooting. Then came the Columbine shooting, and I was like, wow, this is major. But now it seems like every school shooting or mass shooting, it's just, for some reason, it's exploded and starts to happen so much more. Do you see what in society has caused that to happen? Because guns have been around in this country before the country even became a country.
I think it's probably just the breakdown of society based upon people becoming less informed, and you've got parents on the Republican Party who are just extraordinarily ignorant, raising kids. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that the kids themselves are Republicans in school shootings or whatever. It's not as simple as that. But you have a society that believes it's fine and safe to have guns in their home, and kids get exposed to that gun. I mean, the gun shooting in Connecticut that killed 10 years ago, that killed like 25 people. That kid was raised by a gun nut. Yeah, Sandy Hook was raised by his mother was a gun nut. There was literally the most it was the second biggest gun organization after the NRA. I forgot the name. They were based right there. There was plenty of tension before this ever happened about people going off shooting in the woods and doing this and that. And he got depressed, picked up a gun from home, which is easily accessible, and decided to shoot people. Well, that's just gun culture, American gun culture in its prime. And you can't even debate with the Republicans what you're going to do about it. 80% of NRA members are willing to have an intelligent debate about it, but the NRA is not, because it's not a democratic organization. So NRA members need to remove themselves from the NRA and join another gun advocacy group that would at least you can have an intelligent conversation with. But the NRA was taken over, I can't remember, 20 years ago by a bunch of right-wing nuts.
And they only
there's any congressman who takes money, whatever party takes money from the NRA, should be boycotted. It's an insidious organization. And again, I'm not here to take guns away or even talk about gun control.
Do you think society is more disconnected now? And one of the things that people advocate is possibly from technology is what's causing the problems. Is that one of the things you've identified?
Well, what I've identified is, like, I guess what I've spoken about, which is sort of related to what you're saying, is, how come we had this nutty 2016 election? How come people really do not know what they're talking about? How many people are walking around with opinions? And really, we're not interested in opinion. We shouldn't be opinion. We need facts. We need experts. And I think what's made it really bad is and it's not the American public's fault, it's the explosive growth of social media and the disbursement of where one gets one news from. So there's a tremendous amount of nonsense online and people expressing opinions without thinking it through. So people are actually getting less informed. And then you compound that by the actions of foreign agents who could figure out a way to undermine American democracy and also get Americans at each other's throats. It wasn't simply a matter of getting the fearful out and voting, because it's very easy to trigger a fearful brain. They're the easiest people to get out to vote. But it was also they were cunning. I mean, they got Bernie supporters attacking Hillary and supporters, and Hillary supporters voting Clinton or whatever, and Bernie Sanders. So they had those two parties at each other's throats. And admittedly, you can say, well, maybe the National Party gave Clinton too much support. I don't know. I don't want to get into that. But basically, it was they turned progressives upon each other. So any Bernie Sanders voter who was so miffed they didn't vote for Hillary, they're part of the problem, and they were manipulated.
The election...
And I'm not endorsing Hillary. I mean, by the way, I'm not endorsing Hillary over Bernie. I would have been, and vice versa. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I like, I like Bernie Sanders a lot.
So a lot of people talk about that. Hillary Clinton did take away what Bernie Sanders should have had, and if Bernie Sanders was the Democratic candidate, he probably would have beaten Donald Trump, because they say that Hillary Clinton had 30 years of baggage of not telling the truth with media.
Well, first of all, she had 30 years of baggage, but it wasn't 30 years of baggage of not telling the truth. If you look at the numbers, her honesty ratio was extraordinarily high and equated with Bernie Sanders. So they're two of the most honest politicians. But she was definitely gun shy because she's been attacked viciously for 15, 20 years, and she didn't react. I mean, she didn't run a great campaign because of that. She tended to go into a shell. She didn't really interact with her politicians in her plane. But a big mistake in my mind, for me, apart from writing premature books too quickly, her big mistake, I think, was in 2008 when she was running against Obama in the primaries. And you take states like West Virginia, where 1/3 of the Democratic one-third of Democratic voters have basically said, "I will not vote for Obama based on the color of his skin." Now that's racism. If Clinton had just stood up to racism in those primaries, she would have been she could have walked tall. She would have been in a far stronger position. I think people would have rallied round her. She could have been a teachable moment. And by the way, we talk a lot about racism and all the rest in this country. But, up until recently, other countries are just as bad. I mean, so I don't want to say this obviously the South is an American problem, the southern states. But just overall, racism is pretty abundant in every other country. The American people did elect Barack Obama, and America had made, through 2016, massive strides in some of these issues. Talking about these issues, they've also made massive strides in sexual equality. They made in sexual orientation and gay marriage and all the rest. America became cutting edge on some of these issues, even right through 2016, in spite of the growth of the Stupid Party. So it's not all bad, and relative to other countries, not quite as bad as it seems.
We have a little over 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to cram a few things in here. I had Governor Michael Dukakis on a couple of weeks ago, and he says emphatically that 2020 will see a Democratic candidate elected. Do you see that happening, or do you see Donald Trump continuing to win? And again, we're only not even technically halfway through the term until January.
Well, I'd be surprised if he was still running. If he's running in 2020, we'll see. But I guess my point is, I'm not sure, and the reason why I wrote this book, Deliverance, I'm not sure if obviously I'd want that to happen, but I'm not sure if it's going to solve the country's problems. The country's problem is basically income discrepancy trends. If you look at and I'm not against income discrepancy, by the way, I'm interested in the trends. Income discrepancy trends over the last 30 years, and you project that forward for the next 30 years. What will happen to American society? We already are, most people would say, an oligarchy. So as you disintegrate from an oligarchy to something worse, what do you become? As where you have like 200 families a day controlling 50% of the political contributions, that's just going to shrink. So you've got to I'm happy to have any tax policy anybody wants to name, but does it do something to address income discrepancy trends? And until that is addressed, I cannot see how America can save its democracy from its own demise, other than some other numbers that I picked out. That's why the book's called Deliverance. So the penultimate chapter in the book does see some very interesting trends about how maybe money, because at the end of the day, money always wins, and there might be a solution if you look at that money, because the dynamics of money is changing massively since 1985 through today, and it'll continue to change through 2025. And in that change, there is some very interesting patterns that are quite positive within a very sad situation.
Let me ask you this about income inequality. What do you think can ever be done? Because the people who have the most money, I mean, the golden rule has changed now. Instead of what it used to be, treat others as you would have them treat unto you. It's more like those who have the gold make the rules. But the people who have that much money where it just sits in the bank account and the interest literally pays their lifestyle then some.
Yeah.
What
well,
can
this
be
is
done?
This is just forget the rights and wrongs. I don't go down that road. This is just basic fundamental economic theory, and it's Keynesian economics. At the end of the day, if you give tax cuts to the less wealthy, say the bottom 20%, maybe at the expense of people in the top 1%, that is 700% more stimulative to the economy than the tax cuts that you just got last time around. So you have to ask, if you stimulate the economy to that level, the 1% would actually do a lot better if people could afford to buy their products. And of course, income's spending power is probably, for the vast majority of people in this country, has remained relatively stagnant for the last 30 years. So trickle up works a lot better. Now, orthodox economists will agree with me, but not to that extent. They would say it's 2 times, 3 times more effective. I say 700% because those standard economists are making one big error. They're saying the top 50 against the bottom 50. Well, that is not America's problem. America's problem is the top 1%, top 5%, top 0.001% compared to the bottom 20%. And when you do the maths that way on how you stimulate the economy, the numbers are wildly bigger than just being more than 250% more stimulative. It would be 700% more stimulative. So trickle up will work. Food stamps is a great way of stimulating the economy. And by the way, if you look at counties that have the greatest percentage of food stamps, it's not, everyone thinks it's minorities in urban areas. It's white working class, struggling class counties in America that tend to have the greatest percentage of food stamp recipients.
Now, let me ask you a question. Now, you finished this trilogy from Stupidparty Land, and the third one, like I said, being Deliverance from Stupidparty Land. What's your next projects that you're going to work on?
Hopefully I'm done. What I did with this book, I wanted to both make the other 2 books more relevant and update it effectively and change any strategic errors I may have made. But this book is designed not to be impacted by the 2018 election, which I think we knew what would happen a year ago when I started writing the book. And this book takes us through the year 2025 to a point in time where I think we might find an intervention that could actually save America from itself. Right now, if you look at the good guys, people like Bill Gates or whatever, in terms of how they spend their money, they are very successfully solving world hunger. And they're doing it out and world disease, and they're not bothering with America for two reasons. First of all, they're not getting good bang for their buck, and secondly, America doesn't want their help. So, okay, we'll go and solve the problems elsewhere. But America's at some point, going to need an intervention. I'm not saying Bill Gates, obviously, but I explain how that could well happen.
And I guess one thing we have to do is wait so we don't try to avoid the implosion like you would talk about of 2025. Some people even talk about a possible civil war. Again, this country is more divided than it's ever been. We're on the road. Obviously the civil war with Trump. Making statements like encouraging violence. Obviously, I'll beat the crap out of you. I wish the audience, would do a little more of that beating up. Part of the problem is nobody wants to hurt each other anymore. I'd like to punch him in the face. I mean, that has directly led to the violence we've seen since then, which we've seen, attacks on the Jewish community. We've seen the pipe bombing attacking. We're seeing more and more alt-right attacks. We saw the Charlottesville Kristallnacht night a year ago, where Trump refused to condemn fascists. I mean, so clearly he's encouraging that, and that is what is happening. So really, today, if you're a Republican, if you're voting for Trump, it tells me something very simple. It tells me I know what you'd have done in Germany in 1933. It's that simple. The Third Reich, that's right. Unfortunately, we are almost out of time, and I do want you to give a final statement and also talk about where people can buy your books, aside from Amazon.
My final statement is obviously I've attacked Trump voters and all the rest. My books are not polarizing, and the solution is not polarizing. Solutions, and I have an idea as to some mathematical trends that might really salvage American people, even if they're not ready to stand up and take the problem by the balls and deal with the problem. The book is called, obviously, Deliverance from Stupidparty Land, and it's on Amazon. You can get it for an ebook for $5. I'm not doing this for income. I'm doing this to get the facts out there. It's all about general knowledge and understanding basic issues. And my website is stupidpartyland.com, and I have an analysis up today about how the 2018 election is sort of going, which is it's looking better today than it looked 2 days ago, I'd say. And it was a situation which America now can, notwithstanding the Mueller investigation, has a chance to catch its breath and try and move forward.
Well said. Patrick, if you could please stay on air so we could talk after air, so I could thank you off air real quick since we are out of time, everybody. I do want to thank, again, our guest publicly. Patrick, I don't want to mispronounce your last name. Andendall?
Yeah, Andendall.
Andendall. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Everybody remember, the only thing you need to remember about the show is the name of it. I say this every time to drive it in all your heads. Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live. Everything from the website, minds.com, Patreon, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, you name it. I also want to plug in Pam Vrettenberg's website, UnitedTruthSeekers.com, and my moderator, Adam Reed, who also goes by Adderite K Studios. And again, we are out of time, so I can't say much more other than everybody have a good night in the U.S., and those of you in the U.K., you have a good morning. And now I'm officially signing off.